visual, mas agora com a instalação feita nós podemos iniciar. Eu gostaria de convidar para compor a mesa Bert Clark, please, if you can. Bert Clark, professor Bert Clark, é da Universidade do Norte da Carolina e um dos editores da importante revista Monthly Review. Falávamos agora há pouco, Monthly Review, né? Revista que teve atuação intensa de Paul Suisse, Baran e tantos outros, né? Muito lida por muitos de nós e que está prestes a completar 60 anos. Né? Então é com muita felicidade que a gente tem aqui a presença do nosso companheiro Bert Clark. Queria convidar para a mesa também o professor Carlos Walter Porto Gonçalves. O professor Carlos é pesquisador do Claxo e professor de Geografia da Universidade Federal Fluminense. E queria convidar também meu querido amigo professor Mohamed Habib. Né? O professor Mohamed Habib é professor da Unicamp, professor de Biologia da Unicamp, é atualmente pró-reitor de extensão na mesma universidade e é também uma satisfação tê-lo aqui nesta sessão conosco. Nós estamos aguardando a presença do nosso querido amigo, companheiro e professor Plínio Arruda Sampaio. Nós estamos um pouco preocupados porque não conseguimos estabelecer o contato na parte agora da manhã com ele. Estamos aguardando a presença dele, mas temerosos também de que algo possa vir a dificultar a sua participação aqui. De todo modo, se ele chegar ao auditório, naturalmente será convidado para a mesa. Contando inicialmente com a presença de 3 nessa sessão e com o atraso que tivemos, né, eu vou iniciar o debate. Dando um pouquinho mais de tempo, não 20 a 25 minutos como temos feito, mas de 25 minutos, eu combino com os colegas da mesa, com 20 minutos eu aviso 20, faltam 10. Quando chegarmos no limite de 30 minutos, encerramos. Se o professor Plínio chegar, eu reduzo um pouco para 25, como era a proposta inicial. Sem mais, então, eu passo a palavra para o início da apresentação para o nosso colega Bert Clark, repito, que terá até 30 minutos para fazer sua apresentação.
Hello, thank you for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Brazil. I'm extremely excited to be participating in this and by all the young folks that have been at at the seminar so far. It gives me additional hope and excitement about the future. John Bellamy Foster and I prepared this paper together for this special event, and I'm presenting it for the two of us. The topic is the dialectic of social and ecological metabolism. Now, for us, one of the most remarkable aspects of Marxist scholarship in recent decades has been the rediscovery and development of Marx's argument on social and ecological metabolism, which was crucial to his critique of political economy. Marx defined the labor process as in metabolic terms. As he wrote in Capital, labor is, first of all, a process between man and nature, a process by which man, through his own actions, mediates, regulates, and controls his metabolism between himself and nature. Such a conception is two-sided. It captured both the social character of labor associated with such metabolic reproduction and its ecological character, requiring a continuing dialectical relation to nature. Now, recognition of the centrality of the concept of metabolism in Marxist thought has been around a very long time, though its full significance has rarely been grasped until recently. For example, in the 1920s, Lukács emphasized the social mediation and the social interaction with nature, especially through labor as a key to Marx's dialectic of nature and society. But he, however, did not fully develop this line of thought. Now, today's pioneering attempts to build upon Marx's notion of metabolism have taken place along two particular lines. One, through Lukács' younger colleague István Mészáros, in his analysis of capital as a historically specific system of social metabolic regulation. And two, the work of a growing number of ecological Marxists who have built upon Marx's concept and his notion of a metabolic rift, which in particular tries to analyze the social relationships and exchange between nature and society. Now, these two strands of the Marxist analysis of metabolism in regards to the nature-social relationship can be seen as having a complex and dialectical relation. Thus, although Mészáros' work has been primarily concerned with the issues of social metabolic reproduction, this has nonetheless generated some of the most dialectically penetrating and prescient analyses of the ecological problem. Likewise, recent work on ecological metabolism, building upon Marx, has converged with the dialectic of a viable socialist system of social metabolic reproduction, as outlined in Mészáros' Beyond Capital. His work in particular can be seen as laying the foundation and the groundwork for a more synthetic, dialectical conception of social and ecological metabolism. In this approach, the necessary dialectical conception of social and ecological metabolism allows for insights into the qualitative changes in the social order that are demanded by ecology and that are crucial and yet subordinate in regards to a subset of those wider changes required by a viable economy or a new system of social metabolic reproduction. And this, at the same time, helps define the struggle for socialism in the 21st century. Now, the concept of metabolism was established within both chemistry and biology within the 19th century. In particular, it was used to study chemical processes within organisms, the biological operations of organisms, and the interactions with the environment. It allowed scientists to document the specific regulatory and relational processes that direct interchange within a system and between systems. Marx incorporated this concept into all of his major political economic works from the 1950s on, and this allowed him to engage in a metabolic analysis of the dialectical relationship between society and nature. He conceived of metabolism having a specific ecological meaning and a wider social meaning, pointing to the social ecological nature of the concept of metabolism. He employed the notion of metabolism in his analysis of human society and capitalism to highlight the natural process of production as the material exchange between man and nature. By necessity, he argued, there is a metabolic interaction between humans and the earth, as the latter supports life. As I noted, Marx explained that labor is a metabolic process, and through this process, humans actively transform the earth and themselves, creating history in relation to the nature-imposed conditions of human existence. Marx's metabolic analysis recognized that ecosystems have specific regulatory processes that involve complex historical relationships of interchange that aid in their regeneration and their continuance. Due to the interpenetration of society and nature, humans have the potential and ability to alter the nature-imposed conditions in ways that surpass natural limits and undermine the reproduction of natural systems. The concept of metabolism allowed Marx to assess the actual metabolic interactions between nature and society via human labor. At the same time, he was able to study the constantly evolving set of needs and demands that arose with the advent of capitalist society. This reorganization of social production influenced the social metabolism of society as human labor was increasingly alienated from nature. the constant reproduction of capital on an ever larger scale intensified the metabolic demands placed on nature, introducing new social relationships and forms of social ecological exchange that followed the dictates of accumulation. It is here that Marx's metabolic analysis reveals the progressive alienation from nature and the complex interchange that emerges with capitalist development, which illuminates the particular social forces driving ecological degradation. Now, Marx coupled his metabolic analysis with his critique of political economy, revealing how industrialized capitalist agriculture created a metabolic rift, which was a reflection of the unsustainable practices of the system as a whole. He drew upon the work of the great chemist Justus von Liebig and his work on the soil science. And it's here that Marx recognized that the soil nutrient cycle necessitated the constant recycling of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium as plants absorbed these nutrients as they grew. In earlier societies, plant and animal waste were often recycled back to the land in order to enrich replace the nutrients that had been taken up by the plants. But Marx noted that through the enclosure movement, the concentration and privatization of land that accompanied the advent of capitalism, this created a serious division between town and country, displacing much of the population from the land and expanding the urban population. The intensive agricultural practices that were used to increase yields only resulted in the shipping of food and fiber thousands, even or hundreds and even thousands of miles from rural locations into urban centers. As a result, the essential soil nutrients accumulated as waste within urban areas rather than being recycled back to the land. In this, Marx identified that the practices of capitalist agriculture undermined the natural conditions that were necessary for the reproduction of the soil. Marx pointed out that capitalist agriculture disrupts the metabolic interaction between man and earth, i.e., it prevents the return of soil and its constituent elements consumed by man in the form of food and clothing. Hence, it hinders the operation of the eternal natural conditions for the lasting fertility of the soil. In this, Marx described capitalist agriculture as a robbery system that exhausted natural wealth for the sake of profit. Furthermore, he argued that large-scale mechanized agriculture and long-distance trade only intensified the metabolic rift in the soil nutrient cycle. Thus, intensive industrial agricultural practices are often employed to sustain and increase production while attempting to overcome the limitations imposed by the nutrient cycle. Marx warned that the incorporation of industry into agriculture only supplied the latter with the means of exhausting the soil and hastening the rate of environmental degradation. In the mid-19th century, intensive agricultural production in England and other core nations contributed to a global metabolic rift, as millions of tons of guano and nitrates, as well as various other agricultural goods, were shipped from Peru and Chile to the global north to enrich depleted soils. At the same time, this involved the importation of Chinese coolies as forced labor on the guano islands to dig and extract the guano and load it onto ships. These beasts of burden often labored under the most heinous conditions, choking upon the dust from the guano in the air, carrying heavy bags of guano along the islands onto the ships. They were physically beaten for infractions, tied to rocks, tied to buoys out in the water, and they lived very short lives in order to enrich the soils of the global north. The international fertilizer trade ushered in decades of civil unrest, war, debt, and global asymmetries in the international division of nations. The Haber-Bosch process, which allowed for the fixation of nitrogen to produce ammonia on an industrial scale, facilitated the development of artificial fertilizers by capitalists in the global north, increasing the industrialization of agriculture without attending to the source of the metabolic rift in agriculture. This shift in the social-ecological relationship only introduced additional metabolic rifts, additional ecological problems, such as the accumulation of nitrates within waterways and dead zones within the oceans and gulfs. Through this work, Marx demonstrated how capital's insatiable appetite to expand and to accumulate is reinforced by the domination of exchange value over use value, competition, and the concentration and centralization of capital. The impulse of constant growth amplifies the social metabolism of society, increasing the exploitation and the demands placed on nature. The social metabolism of capitalism is increasingly separated from the natural metabolism, producing various metabolic rifts and forms of ecological degradation in natural cycles and processes. This leads to the violation of the nature-imposed regulative laws of social production that maintain the conditions of nature. Now, part of revealing the destructive uncontrollability of capital is to lay bare the social relations of the system, emphasizing the possibility and necessity of social transformation in the mode of production. Marx argued that socialism offered the opportunity to actually pursue human development. At the same time, he emphasized that the transformation of social relations must also involve a process of metabolic restoration. It compels the systematic restoration as a regulative law of social reproduction, and in a form adequate to the full development of the human race. In this, metabolic restoration requires transcending the alienation that characterizes the capitalist system, not merely engaging in reforms of the system. Marx argued that a society of associated producers was necessary to govern the human metabolism with nature in a rational way, bringing it under the control of the people instead of being dominated by a blind power, accomplishing it with the least expenditure of energy and in conditions most worthy and appropriate for the human race. It's here that a sustainable ecological future is bound to a transition to a new social order, presenting human civilization with its greatest and most urgent challenge. Now, the challenge and the centrality of the human social relation to nature, and the fact that it is mediated by an alienated form of labor, generating pollution that characterizes the social environmental life of humanity, is graphically illustrated by Mesa in Marx's theory of alienation. In his Isaac Deutscher Prize lecture that year, he not only presented his understanding of the structural crisis of capital that he saw emerging, and which was to govern his thought, the rest of his thought, he also developed a powerful ecological critique that anticipated, but on a far more radical foundation, the works that were in the limits to growth argument unveiled by the Club of Rome in 1972. As Mészáros wrote at the time, a decade ago, the Walt Rostos of this world were still confidently preaching the universal adaptation of the American pattern of high mass consumption within the space of a single country. They could not be bothered with making the elementary, but of course necessary, calculations, which would have shown them that in the advent of the universalization of this pattern, not to mention the economic, social, and political absurdity of such an idea, the ecological resources of our planet would have been exhausted well before the end of that century, several times over. The ecological and social challenge that confronts us is often minimized as the logic of capital goes unquestioned and various forms to prop up capital are proposed under the assumption that it can be tamed to account for human needs and environmental concerns. Such positions fail to grapple with how the structural determinations of capital must inevitably grind onwards, threatening the very conditions of life, unless systematic change is pursued to eradicate the capital relation entirely. It is here that Mészáros helps illuminate a theory of transition, which at all times is tied to a critique of capital and its persistently destructive proclivities. In addressing the deepening structural crisis of capital and the necessity of social control for a genuine socialist transition, Mészáros articulates how both an ecologically sustainable social order and substantive equality are essential for human development. Without either of these components, the longevity of humanity remains in question, whether it is through the global catastrophe generated by world war or ecological collapse. Like Marx, Mészáros employs the notion of metabolism in his analysis of human society, presenting capital as a historically specific system of social metabolic reproduction. He emphasizes that it is important to recognize how the logic of capital is all-encompassing. Thus, environmental concerns are not an isolated issue. Instead, they are intimately tied to the social ecological relations of the social metabolic order of capital, which requires confronting the question of social control. This particular point only becomes that much more important as we attempt to address global ecological problems, such as global climate change. The capital system, Mészáros points out, is not a rationally controllable mechanism. Instead, it is an uncontrollable mode of social metabolic control. Capital has imposed a particular form of productive interchange between human beings and nature, given its very logic of operation, that is a totalizing framework of control, into which everything else, including human beings, must be fitted and prove thereby their productive viability or perish if they fail to do so. In this, the logic of capital is superimposed upon everything, whether it is healthcare, education, manufacturing, and the environment. Exchange value becomes the universal measure as capitalists attempt to maximize profit. The innermost determination of the capitalist system is expansion-oriented and accumulation-driven. It is not capable of self-sufficiency. It must constantly be renewed, pushing ever onwards, revolutionizing its relations of production, freely appropriating nature wherever it can, and subsuming the entire world to the accumulation process. Given that the accountancy of capital as a universal value where a universal value equation dominates, capital is thus fundamentally unrestrainable and cannot recognize boundaries, whether they are social or natural. So for the first time in human history, we have to confront a mode of social metabolic control which can and must constitute itself in order to reach its fully developed form as a global system demolishing all obstacles that stand in the way, regardless of how devastating the consequences. Its success is solely determined by the extent that it can accumulate further capital. Like Marx, in the Grundrisse, Marx argues that capital recognizes boundaries that can be surmounted, but not boundaries in the sense of absolute limits. It therefore incorporates in its very logic a tendency to overshoot objective limits. Still, Mészáros notes that it has long been evident that capital cannot transcend or escape from its endless series of contradictions, whether they are between production and consumption, production and circulation, competition and monopoly, economizing resources and the waste of resources, accumulation and crisis, or the destruction of the environment due to increasing production. Although capitalism has expanded globally, only enclaves of capital have been produced. An extensive division of labor, of nature, and nations has accompanied this growth of capital. Workers confront worsening conditions of work, as well as declining wages. The accumulation of capital on a global scale negates the possibility of the development of a solitary state for the capital system, as it necessitates inequality at all levels in order to produce profits, and all of this undermines the stability of its order. Instead of substantive equality, which is necessary for the universality of the social world, capitalism has produced inequality, unemployment, exploitation, human misery, war, and environmental degradation. The democracy that's offered to the world comes at the cost of disenfranchising the majority of the world's population through alienated work environments and the ever-increasing threat of violence for the population through through political oppression. Mészáros highlights how the push to enlarge the production of the capitalist system can only be secured through various modalities of destruction. In the realization process today, consumption and destruction are functional equivalents, as destructive forces and wastefulness, such as the military-industrial complex, are pushed to the forefront of the system. Furthermore, the profit-driven system is incapable of effectively regulating its social metabolism between human society and nature, as capitalist production perpetuates ecological destruction on a scale that would take decades to recover from, even if the system was immediately transformed. The uncontrollable mode of the social metabolic order of capital makes it a dynamic system that is constantly developing new means to expand its operations, its ability to extract surplus, and its ability to overcome whatever barriers it confronts. Mészáros stresses that within this system, not only the workers lack control, but even the capitalists, as they are forced to abide by the objective imperatives of the system as a whole, just like everyone else, or suffer the consequences and go out of business. The social economic metabolism of capitalism unites economics and politics within the hierarchical command structure of capital in regard to facilitating the growth of capital. At the same time, within the microcosms of the system, there is an absence of unity as production and control are separated, as are production and consumption. Mészáros explains that social control has been alienated from people and transferred to capital, which only serves narrow self-interest. The problems and contradictions of the social metabolic order of capital only become more explosive the longer that it operates. In the necessity of social control, Mészáros pointed out that humanity must overcome the fragmentation of society and find its unity if it is to survive. Here, he highlighted the relation of ecological degradation to capital's wider, socially uncontrollable logic of waste and destruction. I quote, "Another basic contradiction of the capitalist system of control is that it cannot separate advance from destruction, nor progress from waste, however catastrophic the results. The more it unlocks the power of productivity, the more it must unleash the powers of destruction. The more it extends the volume of production, the more it must bury everything under mountains of suffocating waste. The concept of economy is radically incompatible with the economy of capitalist production, which, of necessity, adds insult to injury by first using up with rapacious wastefulness the limited resources of our planet, and then further aggravates the outcome by polluting and poisoning the human environment with its mass-produced waste and effluence." Ironically, though, again, the system breaks down at the point of its supreme power, for its maximum extension inevitably generates a vital need for restraint and conscious control, with which capital production is structurally incompatible. Thus, the establishment of the new model of social control is inseparable from the realization of the principles of a socialist economy, which center on a meaningful economy of productive activity, the pivotal point of a rich human fulfillment in a society emancipated from the alienated and reified institutions of control. He insists that the issue is not whether or not we produce under some control, but under what kind of control, since our present state of affairs has been produced under the iron fist of private capital. Politics must be emancipated from the power of private capital in order for people to gain self-control over their productive lives and human development. He emphasizes that political control is a necessary component of pursuing a radical restructuring of the prevailing mode of human interaction and control. And control is the necessary prerequisite to an effective control over the forces of nature, which are brought into motion in a blind and ultimately self-destructive fashion precisely by the prevailing alienated and reified mode of human interchange and control. Now it is here that he indicates that capitalism and the rationality of comprehensive social planning are radically incompatible, as the former is concerned with short-sighted interests related to profit, whereas the scale of environmental destruction and the lethality of modern warfare demanded far-reaching and consciously coordinated efforts on a massive scale. Ecological sustainability demands constant vigilance and values independent of the logic of capital and exchange value. Thus, metabolic restoration necessitates a revolutionary change in the social metabolic order to transcend social isolation, alienation, and inequalities, in order to transform the productive relations throughout the world, to establish a new time accountancy, freed from the dictates of capital. Social control is absolutely necessary to create a society that can regulate its social metabolism with the natural metabolism. The necessity of social control is all the more important when we consider what Mészáros calls the absolute limits of capital, especially in regards to the emerging ecological crisis. Every system of social metabolic reproduction has its intrinsic or absolute limits, which cannot be transcended without changing the prevailing mode of control into a qualitatively new one. He warns that even though the absolute limits of capital may be activated, this does not mean that capital comes to a halt and that it ceases to attempt to transcend the barriers that it confronts. Rather, it is quite capable of overshooting these limits, a reality that we recognize today by saying that human resource use is some 20% above the global carrying capacity. It is here that Mészáros raises the issue of absolute ecological limits of capital and the necessity of a sustainable socialist society. Insightfully, he explains that a potentially fatal overreaching of the capitalist social metabolic order of reproduction is its relationship with nature. This point has only gained importance when we consider the state of planetary emergency due to climate change. James Hansen, a leading climatologist in the United States, warns that we are rapidly approaching an ecological tipping point, whereby irreversible climate trends will be set into motion, fundamentally altering the conditions of life on Earth. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change indicates that fossil fuel consumption and deforestation, both of which are intimately tied to economic growth, are responsible for the warming of the Earth. Hansen notes that the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere has increased from the pre-industrial level of 280 parts per million to 387 parts per million today, warning that we need to reduce carbon dioxide concentration to less than 350 parts per million if we want to preserve the planet in a state that has long supported human civilization. Addressing climate change requires social control, which calls into question the social metabolic order of capital, as it is predicated upon constant growth. Vested interests and mainstream economists have come forward to make sure that climate initiatives will not hurt the economy. In the Global Deal, Stern, who is seen as a radical environmental economist and who supports climate action, places the capitalist economy before the protection of the conditions of life. Why? Pushing for a lower carbon target that would protect the Earth and its inhabitants would call for more than the capitalist economy with its pursuit of constant accumulation and profits could possibly deliver. This would present a serious crisis for the economic system, as it would call into question growth and development. Indeed, climate policies that turn the climate into a market via emissions trading seem to offer a new avenue to reduce nature to the logic of capital, delaying social action on an impending ecological crisis. The failure to act should not come as a surprise, given the union between politics and economics. In fact, the lack of social control over capital is what helps postpone the day of reckoning for as long as the all-encompassing expansion process can be sustained. As Mészáros indicated, neither the degradation of nature nor the pain of social devastation carries any meaning at all for this system of social metabolic control when set against the absolute imperative of self-reproduction on an ever-extended scale. The entire structure of capital exists in a fundamental crisis with nature that cannot be resolved within the system. He elaborates on this point by stating, "For it was only a matter of time before capital, in its irresponsible drive to go beyond the encountered limits, had to overreach itself by contradicting its inner logic, thereby colliding with the insurmountable structural limits of its own mode of social metabolic control. For today, it is impossible to think of anything at all concerning the elementary conditions of social metabolic reproduction, which is not lethally threatened by the way in which capital relates to them, the only way in which it can, which involves the destruction of the biosphere, climate change, the destruction of water, every realm within the global ecosystem." He goes on to note, "In the absence of a miraculous solutions, capital's arbitrarily self-asserting attitude to the objective determinations of causality and time, in the end, inevitably brings a bitter harvest at the expense of humanity and nature. Surpassing the absolute ecological limits holds grave implications for the future of humanity. When the social metabolic order of capital confronts limits, its destructive constituents come to the fore with a vengeance, activating a specter of total uncontrollability in a form that foreshadows the self-destruction both for its unique social reproductive system itself and for humanity in general. It attempts to push ever forward, further undermining the vital conditions of existence as long as there is a means to extend the accumulation of capital. Now, the climate debate remains in the death throes of capital, as corporations clamor to present themselves as the solution to environmental degradation without altering the existing social metabolic order. British Petroleum becomes Beyond Petroleum. Advertisements state an oil company, part of the solution. Now, Mészáros stresses that the overthrow of the capital must be eradicated from everywhere because of how deeply embedded it is. A laborious process of profound social transformation is necessary to reorganize labor relations and conceptions of production, which at the same time must mend the rift between nature and society. Only the totality of labor in opposition to capital will provide the means for controlling the social metabolism of life. Short of this, the uncomfortable truth of the matter, he states, is that there is no future for a radical mass movement in our time. There can be no future for humanity itself because the extermination of humanity is the ultimate concomitant of capital's destructive course of development. Thus, waiting and wishing for social change will not eliminate exploitation, social inequalities, and environmental destruction. Fortunately, the activation of capital's absolute limits, including its absolute ecological limits, coincides with mass-based revolt. Only constant, unrelenting struggle can help usher in and create a new social metabolic order. In the structural crisis of capital, he quotes Chavez stating, "I believe that it is not given to us to speak in terms of future centuries. We have no time to waste. The challenge is to save the conditions of life on this planet, to save human species, to change the course of history, to change the world." Now, the path to a sustainable society necessitates social control over the social metabolic order of reproduction, which encompasses all realms of productive life. Marx proposed that human societies must live within the metabolism prescribed by the natural laws of life itself. Metabolic restoration is dependent upon the creation of a new social metabolic order, which is committed to sustaining the vital conditions of life for the present and future generations. In many ways, the definition of sustainability. In this, ecosystems can continue to function and provide various ecological services that enrich the world. Here, we find a necessary synthesis between Marx and Mészáros, formulating a conception of a transition to a sustainable system of social metabolic reproduction. Both substantive equality and ecological sustainability are the cornerstones of such a society, freed from the dictates of the logic of capital. The former helps overcome the divisions that were inherent within the development of capital as a system. Substantive equality helps to overcome the social isolation and alienation that characterizes capitalist relations. Ecological sustainability involves transcending our alienation from nature. The most pressing contemporary environmental problems are intimately linked to the operation of capital. Thus, social action demands incorporating a critique of capital itself in order to eradicate a system predicated on constant, uncontrolled expansion, regardless of the socio-ecological consequences. Influenced by Marx's conception of a society of associated producers and Mészáros' theory of transition, Hugo Chavez has proposed a new socialism for the 21st century, rooted in an elementary triangle of socialism. This roadmap to a new society consists of 1. Social ownership, 2. Social production organized by workers, and 3. Satisfaction of communal needs. Michael Leibowitz explains that if socialism fails to embody these 3 issues, it will not take root and it will cease to be sustainable. It is clear that the elementary triangle of socialism must parallel what could be called an elementary triangle of ecology, as prescribed by the natural laws of life. 1. Social use, not ownership of nature. 2. Rational regulation by the associated producers of the metabolism between human beings and nature. And 3. The satisfaction of communal needs, not only of present, but also of future generations. Marx insisted that human development must be rooted in sustainable human relations with the material world, demanding constant vigilance and a scientifically informed public. In this, the two triangles must become one, allowing an entire society to bequeath it, the earth, in an improved state to succeeding generations. In gaining social control over the social metabolic order, Mészáros emphasizes we must entirely eradicate capital, constructing an entirely new foundation for society and its social relations. This is particularly evident today in the revolutions taking place throughout Latin America. For Mészáros, the creation of a more ecological relation for humanity is not a separate problem, but a crucial, if secondary, part of the struggle to create a qualitatively new social order dedicated to the realization of genuine human needs. As he writes in The Challenge and Burden of Historical Time, ecology is an important but subordinate aspect of the necessary qualitative redefinition of produced goods and services, without which the advocacy of humanity's permanently sustainable ecology, again an absolute must, can be nothing more than a pious hope. In this universal dialectical view, he exemplifies the problem of constructing a viable system of social and ecological metabolism. This stands in stark contrast to the limits of growth argument, which presents it as growth and not the capital system itself. Mészáros presents social and ecological metabolism as one and the same. It is a matter of putting to a humanly commendable and rewarding use the attainable potential of productivity in a world of now criminally wasted material and human resources. The rift in the ecological metabolism, the alienation of nature, requires that the rift in the social metabolism, the alienation of labor, must be overcome. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Bert Clark. Ao mesmo tempo, eu procurei dar um pouco mais de tempo pela necessidade da tradução simultânea, né? Mas devo agradecer pela qualidade, densidade da sua apresentação. Nós passamos agora a palavra para o professor Mohamed Habib. Eu pergunto se está já equacionado, tá? Passamos a palavra para o professor Mohamed Habib.
Boa tarde a todos e a todos os amigos aqui presentes. Quero inicialmente agradecer os organizadores do seminário, em especial meu amigo Ricardo, por esse convite que me honra bastante, e também expressar minha alegria de ver aqui de perto e conhecer de perto o nosso mestre Mészáros e agradecê-lo pelo livro que ele me deu hoje. A minha reflexão não vai precisar muito tempo, né? Vou tentar ficar preso dentro do limite estabelecido para exatamente abrir espaço para o debate. O tema que eu vou tentar concentrar aqui, ela vai ter como base algumas coisas que poucos de nós levam em consideração, embora nós conhecemos, mas que raramente nos demos uma devida atenção a essas questões, que eu vou tentar colocar aqui para entender, né, o que está por trás, né, do colapso do capitalismo, que eu não chamo mais de crise, na verdade já está no colapso já, né? E que vou colocar como duas ferramentas aqui para nós podermos fazer a análise de duas áreas de atuação humana, a indústria e a agricultura. Próximo, por favor. Muito bem, obviamente depois de ouvir a apresentação do Brett Clark, ele já mostrou para nós que desde o pensamento do Marx, a esquerda já vem pensando, já vem analisando tanto a questão capital, como também o lado social, e o lado ambiental, e o lado político dessas interações todas. Portanto, não vou gastar tempo nessa parte histórica para mostrar que, na realidade, o pensamento do Marx parecia, para mim, hoje eu posso dizer isso com certa tranquilidade, parecia uma profecia, né? Ele já previa isso. Só que na época era difícil debater e comprovar e mostrar. Hoje nós temos números e dados e indicadores que o próprio capitalismo utiliza para mostrar para eles que o Marx e outros pensadores de esquerda tinham toda a razão nas suas previsões. Próximo. E eu começo a partir de algumas coisas conceituais que nós precisamos, pelo menos, fazer a nossa reflexão rápida, né? O conhecimento. O conhecimento, eu acredito até que estou me encaminhando para mostrar onde está o buraco, né? O conhecimento, eu entendo que o conhecimento é um patrimônio da humanidade. E tem que ser tratado assim. E sempre era tratado assim até praticamente a Revolução Industrial. A partir da Revolução Industrial, que o conhecimento deixou de ser patrimônio da humanidade e começou a ter propriedade de alguns setores. Se nós olharmos, por exemplo, para a frase de baixo na língua azul, na cor azul, né? Estou falando aqui da Biblioteca Antiga da Alexandria, a minha cidade mãe, inclusive, né? Então, naquela Biblioteca Antiga de Alexandria, que foi destruída pelos invasores, estava escrito exatamente assim na entrada dela, né? Aqui é um tesouro de remédios para a alma. Nele se cura a ignorância, a mais perigosa das doenças e origem dos demais problemas do homem. Então, este era o conceito do conhecimento naquela época. Muito bem. Hoje, quando a gente vê como o casamento entre o conhecimento e o capital, um casamento que eu caracterizo como um casamento ilícito, porque só trouxe prejuízos, aí nós podemos ver, né, como um dos prejuízos mais visíveis hoje é a exclusão social exagerada, né? E na linguagem política, nós também podemos dizer com bastante clareza que o conhecimento ele foi utilizado desde a Revolução Industrial como ferramenta de dominação. E com isso, dividiu o mundo em aqueles que têm o conhecimento dominados, aqueles que têm o conhecimento dominantes e aqueles que não têm o conhecimento tornaram-se os dominados. Numa proporção mais ou menos com esse tamanho. Os dominantes pequenininhos, mas eles dominam a maioria da humanidade. Muito bem, como evoluiu a aliança entre o conhecimento e o capital? E exatamente isso que eu gostaria que vocês participem comigo nessa reflexão e acompanhar a história. Porque isso que vai mostrar para nós porque hoje nós estamos nesse quadro, né, de calamidade e de crise do próprio capitalismo, inclusive. Aí vem a primeira pergunta. Isso é muito importante para nós na academia. Será que a ciência aplicada ela é neutra? Nós sempre falamos que nunca foi neutra. E os cientistas das ciências aplicadas sempre falam, não, ela é neutra. E nós dizemos, não, não é neutra. Ela é dirigida, ela tem uma base por trás dela, né? Ela tem uma ideologia por trás dela. E na maioria das vezes, o que está por trás dela é a ideologia do capital. Muito bem, próximo. Aí nós vamos agora ir para a história para entender o que acontece. Nós vamos para 1883, uma data que todos nós precisamos lembrar muito bem, a Convenção de Paris. A Convenção de Paris foi assinada por 11 representantes de 11 países naquele ano, 1883. Essa Convenção de Paris, ela decidiu que o inventor, ele tem o direito ao segredo, o conhecimento fica oculto, fica protegido, e também ele fica com o monopólio para poder comercializar o seu produto por um período, por exemplo, de 20 anos. 11 países. O quarto assinante desses 11 países é chamado Brasil. O Brasil foi o quarto assinante, em 1883. Quem liderou esse movimento são os países que iniciaram a chamada Revolução Industrial, que tinha investido, principalmente na área das tecnologias industriais. Portanto, eles queriam, além de proteger as suas invenções e seus investimentos, já tinham o projeto de dominação em mente. O Brasil, que foi o quarto assinante, naquele ano de 83, eu pergunto, quantas universidades o Brasil já tinha naquele ano? Quantas instituições de pesquisa o Brasil já tinha naquele ano? Nenhum. Nenhum trabalho de desenvolvimento tecnológico e industrial. Mas, generosamente, foi o quarto assinante. Isso tem a ver com o que nós estamos passando hoje, por favor. Então, hoje nós temos 170 países membros da Convenção de Paris. Significa que esses 182 países concordam com os princípios da propriedade intelectual, da propriedade industrial e do sistema de patenteamento. Sistema esse que começou, então, a separar o mundo naqueles que têm conhecimento, naqueles que não têm conhecimento. Muito bem, vamos tocando essa parte, O Brasil, ele já tem as suas leis da propriedade industrial já modificadas e alteradas, que está em vigor hoje, tem origem de 1996. E o sistema de patenteamento, para nós entendermos o que é patenteamento, basta olhar para essa sala e ver, por exemplo, lâmpada. Tem lâmpada brasileira? Alguém conhece uma lâmpada brasileira? Não temos. É estrangeira a lâmpada. Projetor, computador, televisão, geladeira, carro. Esses todos são produtos patenteados em nome de indústrias estrangeiras. Muito bem. Aí começou a evoluir com a indústria, por exemplo, a automobilística, máquinas, coisas assim. Depois foi para a indústria química. E agora as novas tecnologias, como engenharia genética, como nanotecnologia, são as novas gerações das tecnologias e todos seguem o mesmo princípio, preservando a propriedade intelectual para os inventores. Muito bem. A Organização Mundial da Propriedade Intelectual, órgão ligado à ONU, hoje é ela que administra esse sistema. Próximo, por favor. Muito bem. O que é o objetivo? Qual é o objetivo desse sistema de patenteamento e de propriedade intelectual? E por que tem uma organização mundial? Para exatamente compatibilizar e estabelecer critérios no mundo inteiro para que o controle torne-se mundial. Ou seja, o sistema que controla isso teria uma envergadura para controlar o mundo inteiro. Criar mecanismos cada vez mais fortes para garantir os direitos da propriedade e dos monopólios. Aí atender, obviamente, aos interesses dos países industrializados centrais. Muito bem, vamos lá. Quais são as consequências do monopólio e da apropriação do conhecimento? Aí temos aqui uma série, acho que todos nós conhecemos, não precisa gastar muito tempo nisso, porque aqui não tem novidade. o desequilíbrio entre os povos, né, efeitos negativos na educação, o próprio Brett já mencionou isso na sua fala, prejuízo no desenvolvimento social. Imagine na segunda linha de preto, quando falo do